I'm Andrew Joseph Keith. I'm an artist and sculptor, and in this video I'm going to talk about how to get into portrait sculpting if you're just a beginner. The first thing we're going to want is a lot of references. So for this sculpture, I'm using references of Scarlett Johansson that plays Black Widow. If you are using references of celebrity, just make sure it's one that you can get plenty of references from, especially the side view. The side profile view is really important, so if you can get some good references from that view. If you're taking the references yourself, then I recommend backing away from the person and then zooming in with your camera and then having them slowly turn all the way around with the same expression, 360, and that way you have every angle. So make sure you have good references and a lot of them. Okay, the next thing is your armature. For this one, I've just got a simple baseboard, which is a piece of plywood, and then I put a floor flange on top of that and a metal rod on top of that, then some crumpled up paper and a paper bag over top that I've tied. Just a really simple armature. Then as far as clay, I'm using Chavant Medium NSP clay. It's a non-drying plasticine clay that's oil and wax based, so it doesn't dry out. So next we're going to build a block-in of the head. For this, I like to make just a simple wedge shape that tapers towards the front of the face and then gets wider towards the back. And then from the side view, we want it to be kind of like an axe shape, roughly the shape of the head, and that's going to be smaller than our sculpture will be so that we can build on top of that. So once the block-in is in place, then we can start to give an outline of the side profile of the face. So this is when we're looking at the side view of the face from one side or the other, and trying to capture that likeness from the side profile view. This is really important because this becomes our guideline for the rest of the features. Here you can see I'm using an app to help me check myself. It's the DaVinci Eye app, really helpful. And there you can see I've captured that side view. For this next part, I'm using a knife to draw out some guidelines to help me as I'm building out the forms in clay. And I want to start by focusing on the high points of the skull. So here's a little skull where I've marked out those high points in red. So I'm looking at the ridge of the eye, the outside corner of the eye, and pay attention to that angle from the side view. I'm looking at the cheekbones, the jaw bones. We've already established that front plane of the face. And then later on, I'll be adding some of the widest point, which is towards the back of the head, which is also another high point that I like to lay in, and adding in things like the mound of the mouth and the chin. So this stage of the sculpting process is all about laying in those bony features and thinking about the face as if it was super thin, if all of the skin and fat was just kind of sucked into those bones. We want to focus on those bony structures of the skull first, and that gives us a solid foundation to build the features on top of. And I'll add in just a little bit of an indication for the hairline and then fill in some of that safe area in between things like the cheekbones and the jaw bones. And I'm trying to now start to work on the sculpture all around. Once we have an indication of those bony features, then I can start to move on to some of the details, things like adding the nostrils to the nose and starting to build out the mass of the lips. But you'll notice that I'm building that on top of a mound of a rounded shape, the mound of the mouth. And so making sure that I have the underlying forms in place first is really helpful. Then we're going to start to focus more on the front view of the face, what it looks like from the front view. And at this point, we can kind of slow down and be more careful and use smaller pieces of clay to give an indication of those features. I'm going to come in and add some clay for the ears. That really helps when you're trying to capture the likeness from the front view, having those ears in place so that you can compare the ears to the rest of the facial features. That's really helpful. And for this, it's important that you make sure that when you're observing your references, that the references aren't of the person when they're looking too far up or too far down, because that'll make the placement of the ears appear different than what it actually is. So you want to make sure that the ears are placed right in comparison with the angle of the head, in comparison with where the person's looking. So now I'm coming in with more details and starting to fill in those features and add a little bit more thickness and mass to things like the cheeks. There's a really helpful lesson if you're interested in portrait sculpting that goes over the fat pads. It compares the fat pads of the face with the muscles of the face. and that's over on the Proco 3D YouTube channel. And the fat pads are a really important thing to be aware of when you're sculpting, because they really change the structure of the face, and I think more so than the muscles of the face. And so something that I wasn't really aware of but really helped after I studied it was the fat pads of the face. So now I'm coming in and starting to smooth out these forms. You can see on the form like the sternocleidomastoid muscle, which is that muscle that comes from the behind the ear and then down to the pit of the neck. Really important muscle for portrait sculpting. You can see that I'm coming across the form as I'm smoothing that out. I like to lay in the clay along the form and then come over top of the form and across the form from different directions, and that tends to soften it up, make it much more realistic and natural, rather than coming along the form with all of the strokes. So first thing, I'll lay in the form, and then I'll come across the form with a tool or with my hand. You can see I'm doing the same thing with the cheekbone. The cheekbone's coming this way, so I lay in the clay this way first, and then I'm coming over top and coming across or over the form in different directions, and that helps soften everything, make it feel much more supple and lifelike and like skin or flesh. Yeah, that softness of the cheeks. And so here you can see what it's looking like at this stage. I've given an indication of the things like the eyebrows, and then added in the upper and lower eyelid with pieces of clay and tried to smooth those out. If you're interested in sculpting, if you like things like this, be sure to subscribe to the channel. There's also the Proco 3D YouTube channel where I have additional lessons and demos. All of that content is based on the courses that I teach over at Proco.com. There's a portrait sculpting course and a figure sculpting course. So whether you're interested in sculpting the portrait or the full figure, there's two really helpful courses which I think are some of the best out there. And so if you're serious about sculpting, I hope that you'll check those out. You can find links to those courses in the description. And so now I'm coming with a knife and drawing in some of the indications of the separations that I'm seeing between the forms of the face. And so if I see a plane change or a shadow shape from the reference images, I want to come in with a knife and just give an outline of those to kind of keep myself on track with where those forms are going and where they end and when they transition to different forms. So for example, when that cheekbone transitions to the form of the lower cheek, just having those lines in place and then being able to check from one side to the other to make sure that things are symmetrical really helps to draw in these guidelines. And drawing in guidelines, like drawing in the center line like I'm doing here, that's a really helpful thing to do regularly throughout the process, because drawing on top of the sculpture is so much faster than adding clay and then making a mistake and having to remove clay. It's easy to move a line that's drawn in the clay, whereas moving clay around is much more cumbersome and takes a lot longer. So now I'm coming more with tools. I really like this tool. It's kind of a flat tool that has like a spatula end, and that helps me to smooth out the forms and get things more accurate. If I need to remove some clay, then I'll usually use a pottery tool, like a loop tool, and that just helps me scrape away some of the clay if I've built up too much clay in an area. One of the main things to remember is that additive sculpture is all about building up from thin to thick and slowly building out those forms. Here you can see I didn't add enough clay to the back of the head, to the mass of the skull, which is a common beginner mistake. So make sure that you have enough clay in the skull area, the back area of the head. And it's all about starting simple and then slowly adding complexity. So start thin and simple, slowly add mass and complexity. There was a recent video that I did that talks just about this one concept that I think if most beginners could apply this concept of starting simple and thin and then slowly adding mass and complexity, that would make a big difference in their ability to capture these very complicated forms. The portrait is like the most difficult thing, in my opinion. It's the most difficult thing that any artist can take on, and especially in 3D when you're taking on the portrait, you don't have to worry about the portrait just from one angle or just the light shapes of the portrait as you're painting or drawing it. You have to worry about those shapes from every angle and how those shapes come into one another, transition between each other, and so it's a very complicated process. So whatever you can do to break it down and focus on just one thing at a time, simplify that process, will really help and make it easier to tackle something as difficult as portrait sculpting. A free lesson that I recommend watching if you're interested in portrait sculpting is my lesson that goes over the 10 steps to portrait sculpting. And so I've talked a little bit about those steps in this video, but it's a much more concise video that just goes over each of those 10 steps. And that's a really helpful framework to have in mind as you're sculpting the portrait. So I found that when students are just starting, if they don't have some sort of system to follow, then the portrait does become very overwhelming. So that's why I really like those 10 steps, because then you can be focused on just one step at a time and then complete that step, check it, make sure that the step is accurate. And if you do that step accurately, then you'll have a solid framework to build the next step on top of. And if you can do the whole portrait following those steps, I think you'll find that portrait sculpting to be a lot easier and more manageable. Even though it's still difficult, it's always difficult. Every portrait is difficult. Even with this one, I didn't get the likeness by the end that I was hoping for, but that's just how it goes sometimes. With every sculpture that you do and every portrait that you do, you get just a little bit better. Now I'm coming in and adding the hair. For this, with hair, you just want to think of it as chunks or big clumps of hair. Think about if hair was smoke, and I'm just coming in with pieces of clay and trying to think about the shape of the hair, maybe the outline of the hair from different angles, and then bring those pieces of clay in that direction. But don't think of it as individual hairs, especially at the beginning. Don't worry about texturing every individual hair follicle. So now I'm coming in and filling in the eye socket with some clay for the eyeball, and then drawing in. Once that clay is in place, then I draw some circles to give me an idea of where the eyes are looking. And then I scoop out the irises to make a bowl shape. And then I'll come in and just add a little hole in the middle for the pupil. And I've just found that this kind of gives the illusion of the lens of our eye. Just having that bowl shape is really helpful. And now it's all about the details, working on the details and softening and pushing those forms, just hopefully a little bit more towards what you're seeing in the reference photos. Again, observing the reference photos all the time. I have them just on my phone right below the sculpture. And so I'm constantly going back and forth between the references and the sculpture. And I'm taking this tool and kind of smoothing out the hair, going along the direction of the hair to give an indication of the direction that hair is flowing, and cleaning up areas like the inner parts of the eye. And then with this tool, with my favorite tool, I like to take little pieces of clay and add them onto the sculpture and then smooth them out like I'm doing here with the sternocleidomastoid muscle. And so then I can build up the forms while texturing. And I like this loosely tooled texture that I get from using this tool. Here I'm coming back to the hair, adding some more, having fun with the forms and just trying to think about those big curls as simple shapes. You know, it just comes out on one direction, maybe it twists inside, but trying not to overcomplicate things. The hair, you know, can be overwhelming, but just try to simplify it. Simplify everything. As I'm doing the texture, I'm trying to come along the direction of those locks of hair that I've laid in with chunks of clay. Again, if you're really interested and passionate about portrait sculpting, then I definitely recommend the portrait sculpting course. There's lessons that go over the anatomy, like I was saying, the fat pads of the face, lessons on sculpting the hair, the anatomy of the hair, so we break up the hair into chunks, being able to represent features like the mouth, the nose, the eyes, doing studies of those features. There's lots of demos and things like that. So if you're interested in this type of thing, I definitely recommend checking out that course. And if you don't get the full course, then at least check out those free video lessons over on the Proco 3D YouTube channel. There's a lot of helpful information and things that I wish that I knew when I started sculpting, and that's what I've tried to include in all of the content, the sculpture-related content that I put out. So now finishing up those details of the hair, starting to look a little bit better. Really, we just want the whole sculpture to feel like there's no areas that were left behind or that don't match the rest of the sculpture. And here, at the end, I didn't like the features of the eyes. And so I'm just removing them and sculpting, and I'm gonna try sculpting them again. And so that's one thing. If you're beginning, sometimes you'll do a really nice eye on one side, and then the other one you'll struggle with, or you'll feel like the eyes are good, but then you realize they're not in the right placement. They're too high or too low on the face. So I'd say don't be afraid to just remove clay, start over, and try it again, because you learn and you get better at sculpting each of those features every time you do it. And so even though they don't always turn out, every time you get a little bit better. So don't be afraid of making big changes even later on in the process. So that's where I'm going to leave it for this video. Hopefully this gives you a lot of tips and things to think about if you're interested in portrait sculpting. I definitely recommend giving it a try. Go out and sculpt. The only way you can get better is by actually doing it, not by watching YouTube videos. You actually have to go and do it. You have to go and make some sculptures. So go out, make some sculptures, stay creative, stay productive, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.